The Halo TV show Season 1 has officially come to an end, and yet here I stand on ground that could end up getting me put into a bad light with some people. But honestly, I don't really care. Whatever comes from this video, I will take, and I will take it boldly. I'm here to not only review the first season of the new Halo TV series, but I also want to give my perspective on why I'm defending it from a lot of the hate and toxicity that it has gotten online. And at the end of the day, my opinions are my opinions, and however you feel about the show is totally fine, but I do feel the show has been getting too much hate lately. I would greatly appreciate that you comment down below what you thought of the show, whether you are on the side of liking it or not liking it. I'm still here for the conversation, and I want to talk to anybody who may share their opinions on how they feel about it or not. If you liked the video and you like what I had to say, drop a like on the video and subscribe if you are new to the channel. I would greatly appreciate that. Overall, if we just want to jump straight into it, I thought the first season was decent. Not great, not good, not bad, and certainly not trash, as it seems that's the biggest term being used to describe it. I think the show is probably somewhere in the middle as of right now. I feel as though with all the 9 episodes that we got, I overall feel that some were good, some were a bit lackluster, and then you had an episode like the Quan-focused one that I felt was a bit wasted and unnecessary. Episode 1 was solid, Episode 2 was a bit of a step down, Episode 3 was a step up and interesting, Episode 4 took a bit of a step down again, and then we got to Episode 5, which at the time I thought was the best episode by far. The later half of the season ended up going into an interesting direction where we would learn about the Halo ring and certain other plot points concerning our main characters. And then we got the season finale, which I had tweeted that I wasn't trying to overreact, but I genuinely thought the season finale was one of the best season finales of television that I had personally ever seen. My mind was blown watching the Chief and Silver Team kick Covenant ass. Everything I wanted to happen, happened, and everything I wanted to see for the action was all I got in that finale. No matter where you stand on this series, you can't deny that that finale was incredible and by far the best episode that we got. If we get a lot of what we had in that finale in Season 2, I have a feeling it may bring a lot of people together a lot more than what it is going for right now. Now, I feel it's maybe appropriate to start off with the criticisms of the show and this season, since I have a feeling most people will be more curious to know that than my positives, but I didn't like anything to do with this storyline and this character. I didn't like whatever was going on here with all this stuff, and I didn't like this guy and his story, and I didn't like this dude at all, and I didn't like this a whole lot when this guy was on screen. And I did not like Episode 7 other than the action scene at the end. And last, but certainly not least, I really did not like whatever the hell was going on here with this scene. Along with all that, I do feel there's some bad writing throughout for certain storylines, characters, and a lot of dialogue at times that can feel wooden, and then also can stem from some not so great acting, particularly from the scientist guy who works with the Halsey character that I mentioned. No offense to him in any way, but I just thought that the actor was not great here at all in this show, just me personally. Now, with that all being said, let's run through the list of all the things that I did in fact like and at times really love seeing on the big screen for the show. I like everything that had to do with the Covenant, whether that being the showing of the Prophets, the Covenant army with the ships, Covenant forces including the Jackals, Grunts, Elites, and even the Brutes that we get to see in Episode 5 and the finale. Showing the glassing of a planet and its effects was also a really cool thing to show in this season. All the stuff having to do with the UNSC, Oni, the Spartans, Marines, and the outscope of a planet like Reach, which is where the human side of the story primarily takes place on. All these things were cool to look at since we don't normally get too many big looks at them in some games, especially the most recent Halo titles from 343. I really liked Cortana being in this show, and I felt not only was it genius bringing in the original voice actor to portray her, but man, the effects on her over time really did improve. They were a little weird to look at in the beginning because of the way that the human form that she exemplified, but once she's in handheld form size, it actually looks really good. Overall, her presence in the show was very much nice to see, since her ability to be with the Chief in the games is something that always drives those stories, no matter how many times we've seen it. I also like a lot of the stuff to do with the character of Halsey, who is very prevalent in the games and the story behind a lot of the world of Halo that we know. She is very much a villain here in a lot in a lot of cases, and her goals at times were not the most sound ideas in the world, but they are pretty much very effective in motive. Another character that I really, really liked in the show was the character of Soren. He, in my personal opinion, was a very interesting character based off his background. He is basically a rogue Spartan who went off the books when he was in training with the chief, and so I just found that the idea around a character like him, who is basically this pirate now, and he's not really the greatest guy in the world from the sense of the kind of things that he does, but the story behind his character is very interesting, and the actor in Bokeem Woodbine actually plays him very well, so that character was one of the more interesting parts of the show that I did really like from a character perspective. Our main man, Master Chief, played by Pablo Schreiber, is very well done here, and yes, as much as people will say that he is a quote-unquote character assassination of the character, I completely disagree. I think the show is giving us their version of his character as much as to what the books did with him. The book Chief is very different than the game Chief, like how the show version of Chief is different to the game's version. Pablo is good as Chief, and he's a good actor, so I think they've got somebody good to play him. Yes, the OG voice is not there, but for this particular style of storytelling, it doesn't really need it, per se. The show is allowed to have its own version of the character. I'm not really sure why everybody thinks that he needs to be like the game's version, since not only are they not connected, but also no one said he had to be that way. It doesn't break the canon, and it doesn't break the lore of the game, since it is its own separate timeline. We see this with something like the MCU, for example. The comics are the dominant form of what people see in those characters and storylines. The MCU very clearly doesn't follow that, and yet I never see anyone ever complaining about that. Yes, there are people who don't like that at all, but the percentage of them is so small as to the majority of people who do love the MCU and have been loving it ever since it started. I just really don't understand why here it has to be so different for hardcore Halo fans. I feel like I've pretty much made my point here, so I'm just going to move on for now. The acting all around from the majority of actors in the show, minus the scientist guy that I mentioned earlier, is actually very good, and everyone plays their roles very well for the type of character that they are playing. The directing all around is alright, and it feels very TV-like in style. Most of the writing does work, and a lot of the writing just doesn't work at all with most of the stuff that I mentioned in my criticisms. A lot of the writing, as I mentioned in my criticisms, is really where the majority of it doesn't work at all, especially with the Quan character, who, to this day, at first I was giving her a chance, but after a while, her character really fell off the deep end for me, and I couldn't get on board with her at all. Her motivations were there, but at the same time, she was just so poorly written from a personality perspective that I couldn't get on board with her at all. From a technical standpoint, the cinematography is actually really good. The way in which a lot of planets are viewed it's pretty dope, I'm not gonna lie. The City of Reach is always cool to look at from the aerial shots, and as a cool segue over to the action, if there was one thing that this show needed, and I mean absolutely needed to get right, it was the action. And with every scene we got with action, it totally works, and man was I entertained, especially as I mentioned earlier with that finale, which was just incredible. The CGI, while on a TV budget, had its many ups and its downs, and then sometimes you could tell it didn't work all the time, but to be fair, a majority of the effects and the CG was actually really good, especially on the Prophets, which I still can't tell if they are puppets or full CG. That is how good that they looked. The production design of everything in this show is definitely for sure where a lot of the budget was spent on, and you can tell because that's why it looks so good. The outfits, the vehicles, the sets and locations all look and feel like something that you would see out of a Halo game. So now that I've gone over everything with regards to what I liked and disliked about the show, I now want to jump into the show's defense for a bit, and this part may or may not include spoilers, so you have been warned if you have not seen the show, but I assume since most people probably have seen the show and they're coming here to watch this video, I will basically go on from there, so I will probably potentially talk about some things inside of it. Now, why do I defend this show? Is it because I am a shill, or because I'm an idiot and don't have a brain, or any sense of good knowledge as to why I like the show? No, of course not. It's none of those things. Even if I got paid to like this show, I would still critique it because at the end of the day, criticism is valid, especially if you want to see things improve, and besides, I'm a nobody on YouTube. Paramount, Showtime, and all of them probably don't even know I exist. I do generally like this show, and I think it has a lot of good to it. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I also acknowledge it has a lot of bad to it, and mistakes were made around the writing of certain characters and plot lines, and so on and so forth. I don't feel I need to reiterate those issues. What I do also acknowledge is that this show is simply telling a different story and telling it in a different style than what we are used to from the games, which is probably where the biggest examples will come from as a comparison. This type of storytelling is something we aren't used to in most of the Halo games. With the Halo games, we mostly only ever see Chief and his companion Cortana exploring the galaxy, fighting the Covenant, and then sometimes looking for artifacts simultaneously. Of course, not all the games do this. Halo Reach and Halo 3 ODST don't even have Chief in them or Cortana, and yet to some, those are the most underrated Halo titles that we've had in the franchise of games. I've also seen quite a lot of people say things like, "This is not Halo," or "This is not my Halo." Well, okay, but by technicality, you can't really say that this show is, quote, not Halo. If you look up what the definition of Halo is, it reads, "Halo is a military science fiction video game and media franchise." Take those words, military and science fiction. Do we get that in this show? Well, yes, we absolutely do. We get a lot of military stuff and we get a lot of science fiction sprinkled throughout. So by definition, this show is Halo. But then you'll have people say, well, it's not the game's version of Halo. Well, why does it have to be? Why does the show absolutely need to be like the games? Wouldn't you rather the show being its own thing than just adapting a story that we've seen before from one of the games? I know I certainly want that, because at the end of the day, if I just want one of the game's stories, I can just go play the game. And that's what makes the idea of different stories in the same media so fascinating. You can have different versions of the world be told through different storytelling narratives. Just because you see things that you aren't used to seeing in something like the game, for example, doesn't mean it's not Halo. People having sex, particularly Chief in this case, is probably something that happens in the world of Halo. Of course, is it something that I needed to see happen in the show? No, of course not. I still don't like that scene at all, and I felt it felt forced. It made no sense. But just this one scene alone doesn't mean that the show is not Halo. I feel too many are conflating these big overreactions to scenes like this as a way to justify their hate for the show and subsequently say it doesn't feel like Halo. Instead of saying it doesn't feel like Halo, a better way of saying it would be it doesn't feel like the Halo games. The biggest example of all this, and I've seen too many times to count, is around the idea of Chief taking off his helmet and his armor. Why can't he? Who is saying that he absolutely cannot take it off? This show is set in a different timeline from the games and the books, therefore he absolutely has the right to take it off. The show is not required to do anything other than tell the story, of which is separate from those different pieces of media. If this show had been connected to either the games or the books, then I would absolutely be on the side of all the fans complaining. But because it isn't, this complaint to me is simply, it's not valid. It doesn't make sense to me. In some way, I can compare this to how something like the MCU handles its characters and the lore from the comics. The amount of times the MCU doesn't follow anything from the comics, you really never see anybody go up in arms and complain. Some do, but the majority don't. And why is that? Why is it so different here for the game fans to see that's totally okay for the show to do something different than what we've seen many times already? If Chief takes his stuff off in the books, does that make the books not Halo? If all you want is action, 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 action all the time and fighting the Covenant, the games excel all the time at that, and that's why the games are great, because they give you that ability to do that. The games have always been gameplay first and story secondary. Here in the show, it's the flip side of it, in which, for me, I don't really mind that. I like that the show took a risk in trying to give people a different side of the world of Halo while also sprinkling in that action goodness that we got. For me, I just feel the amount of complaining and whining and critiquing for the show has gone too far, and I'm not saying that people can't critique it, and I honestly don't know what people really want anymore. The season finale releases, and we get a lot of what people wanted, and they still find a way to complain about it. So it's like, what can you really say at this point? What exactly do you want? I feel like I should mention it again, but I recognize that this show has issues and bad things in it, but I don't let all of that consume me into just calling the entire show trash. Just because one scene in episode 8, for example, with the sex scene happened, doesn't mean that the rest of the episode is garbage or that the entire show is trash. I don't think the show is great by any means. I don't think it's good, bad, or trash. It's just somewhere in the middle, which is why now after the season finale, I can say that I would give season 1 of the Halo show a rating of around 6.5 to 7 out of 10, which to me just means okay, decent, and just fine. It's there. I don't usually want to give ratings much more anymore, but for me here, I feel it's probably necessary to help people get an idea as to where I stand on it. At this point, I feel I have done enough talking, and my point will still stand no matter what. I have heard from some people that apparently there could potentially be a change in writers and personnel around the show. I don't know if that's necessarily true, considering it originally was a Showtime show, and now it's of course with Paramount, but it remains to be seen since season 2 has already been greenlit. For the sake of the fans, I hope some of the criticisms people had are addressed and changed, because at this point, trying to converse with people on the show it goes places that I only wish I didn't have to go to. I do feel it is good to talk with people who feel differently, but at times when talking with toxic and hateful people, it just ends up going nowhere. And so if anyone comments below their thoughts, I would just appreciate if it's done in a formal and respectful manner to not stoke hate or toxicity to any one person, no matter what side that you stand on. Other than that, I feel I have said my piece, and so I hope season 2 can do better in a lot of areas while keeping the formula of others. Time will tell what we get, and hopefully fans can come to an understanding on things. No matter where you stand on the show, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and a great weekend. A great weekend. As for me, I'm actually going to be graduating from college, so a lot of good is happening in my life, and so yeah, that's about it for me though. So I hope you all have a great rest of your day. All love and all respect, and so I'll see you all in the next one.